There are some things a town will forgive you for. A bad harvest, a drunk husband, even a debt you never pay back if you smile right when you pass folks on the road. But there is one thing Bitter Creek would never have forgiven me for, and I knew it the morning I opened my cellar door and slid two strangers down into the dark with my own hands. I was 61 years old. I had buried a husband, a son, and a daughter I told everyone was dead long before she ever was. I had nothing left in this world but 40 acres of failing grass, a milk cow with one good eye, and a name people still tip their hats to out of habit. And I was about to lose all of it, on purpose. If you had ridden up to my fence that spring and asked me why an old woman would hide a wanted mountain man and a little girl who wouldn't speak, why she'd lie to the sheriff's face, burn her own letters, and stand between a loaded rifle and a stranger she'd known 3 days, I'd have told you the same thing I told everyone. Mind your business. But that's not the real reason. The real reason took me 30 years to understand, and a long time before I could say it out loud. So let me tell it now while I still can, start to finish, the part the town saw and the part they didn't. You'll think you know where it's going. You won't. The dog started barking before I heard the horses, and I have learned in my life to trust the dog over my own ears. I was on my knees in the kitchen garden when she set to it, old Ruth, half-blind, mostly ribs, the kind of dog that won't bark at coyotes but loses her mind over men. That was how I knew. I didn't even stand up straight. I just sat back on my heels in the cold dirt with a fistful of green onions in my hand and felt my whole body go quiet the way it does right before something bad. 3 riders, coming up the wagon track from town, easy, not in a hurry, which somehow was worse. Men who think they're going to find what they're looking for don't rush. I want you to understand something before I go on. That morning I had no plan. I want to be honest about that because later when the talk started, people said I must have schemed it. Della Mercer always was sly, they said. Quiet ones are. But there was no scheme. There was a man and a child in my barn who'd been there 2 nights, and there was the sheriff coming up my road, and there was the cold, simple arithmetic of those 2 facts meeting. I stood up. My knees cracked. I brushed the dirt off my apron slow, because slow is how you look like a woman with nothing to hide, and I walked not to the house, not to the gate, but to the barn. I had maybe 90 seconds. Let me back up. 3 days, not 90 seconds. It was the 2nd week of April, the kind of spring we get up here in the foothills where the snow doesn't so much melt as it just gives up in patches, leaving the ground a mess of mud and the air with that smell, wet pine, cold mud, wood smoke from the chimney that never quite goes out. I keep a ledger, have my whole life. My husband Tom used to laugh at me for it, said I'd write down the weather like God needed my notes. But it's how I think. Numbers settle me. So does writing a thing down, even a thing I don't want to look at. The entry for that first night reads, in my own hand. April 9. Wind from the north, cow off her feed. A man at the door gone half to bone carrying a child, did not ask his name. That's all I wrote. I didn't write that he'd knocked so soft I almost didn't hear it. I didn't write that when I opened the door with the lamp up, the first thing the light caught was the child's face pressed into his shoulder, one eye open, watching me, and that something in my chest turned over so hard I had to grip the doorframe. I didn't write how thin she was. I'll get to that. He was a big man, or had been. You could see the size of him in the bones of his shoulders, but the meat had gone off him. His coat was a thing of patches. His beard had grown wild, and his eyes had that flat, careful look that men get when they've been hunted long enough to stop sleeping. He didn't beg. That's the thing I noticed even through my own fear. A begging man fills the air with words. This man just stood there, swaying a little on the porch boards, and said, "Ma'am, the girl needs to be warm. I'll work it off. I'll be gone by morning." And then the child coughed. I have raised children. I have buried one. I know the sound of a chest going wrong, that wet rattle down low, and I knew it the second I heard it come out of that little body. It wasn't a cold. It was the thing that takes children in the mountains in the spring, the thing that took half a generation up here in the bad winters, the thing I'd heard come out of my own son the year he was 4, and we sat up 9 nights running and only luck, and a fever breaking at dawn let me keep him. That cough is why I opened my door. I want to be honest about that too. It wasn't kindness, not pure. It was that sound reaching into a part of me I'd nailed shut 30 years before and putting its hand right on the wound. "Get in," I said, "before someone sees the light." I didn't know then why I said before someone sees. I didn't know yet that he was wanted. Some part of me knew anyway. You don't carry a child up a foothills track in the dark, knocking soft, eyes flat as river stones, unless the daylight is a thing you can't afford. His name, I learned over the next 2 days, was Eli Hart. The child was Wren. 6 years old, he said, though she was the size of a 4-year-old, all wrist and collarbone, with a tangle of black hair I'd later spend an hour combing out by the fire while she sat perfectly still, and let me, the way a child does when she's been alone with grief too long to remember being touched gently. She did not speak, not one word those first days. Eli said she'd talked once, said it like a man laying a stone on a grave. She used to sing, he said, and didn't say more, and I didn't ask, because I have learned that the questions you most want to ask are the ones that cost the most to answer. I put them in the barn. Understand, it wasn't unkindness. The barn was warmer than half the houses in the county, banked with old hay, and the loft caught the morning sun. I put a tick mattress up there and hauled blankets and the second of my 2 good lamps. But the real reason for the barn was the same reason I'd said before someone sees. If a neighbor came calling, a man and a child in my house was a story that would be all over Bitter Creek by supper. A man and a child in my barn I could deny. I am ashamed now of how quickly I learned to think like that. How fast the old habit of hiding came back to me, like riding a horse you swore you'd never get on again. That first night after they were settled, I sat at my kitchen table with the lamp turned low and the ledger open, and I didn't write anything for a long while. I just sat there with the pen going dry. Because I knew. I think I knew from the moment the light hit that child's face. I knew that little girl's eyes. They were my daughter's eyes. Now, I told you the town thought Della Mercer's daughter was dead, and that I'd let them think it. Here is the part of the story I never told a living soul until now. Her name was Iris, my Iris. She was the prettiest thing this county ever made, and she had a will on her like a spring flood, and when she was 17 she fell in love with the wrong man, and I did the worst thing a mother can do. I chose the town over my own child. He was a trapper, a mountain man, the kind that comes down out of the high country twice a year smelling of smoke and blood and trades pelts and is gone again. People up here are decent enough until you scratch them, and then you find all the old fears underneath: fear of the wild men, the ones who live where the law doesn't reach, who marry Indian women, who don't come to church, who answer to nobody. When Iris took up with one of them, the town didn't even have to say a word to me. I felt the temperature change. I felt the doorways get narrower when I walked through them. I was a widow by then, running this place alone, and respectability was the only thing keeping the wolves of poverty off my throat. So when Iris stood in this very kitchen, 16 years old, and told me she loved him and meant to go, I told her if she walked out that door, she was no daughter of mine. I said it to keep my place in the town. She walked out the door. She was the bravest of all of us, my Iris, and I was the coward, and I have known it every single day since. I told people she'd gone east to family. When the years passed and folks stopped asking, I let it harden into a different story, that she'd taken sick out there and died. It was easier to be a grieving mother than a mother who'd thrown her own child away. The town pitied me. Pity is so much warmer than scorn. I let myself be warmed by it for 30 years. And now there was a child in my barn with Iris's eyes, and a broken man who would not meet mine, and a cough in the night that I would have given my own breath to stop. I had not let myself do the arithmetic yet. I want you to know that. I sat at that table the first night and I would not let the numbers add up, because if they added up it meant Iris was somewhere out in the world or out of it, and this was the closest I would ever come to her again, and I was 61 years old and could not survive that. So I told myself, a stranger, a man and his daughter, Charity, gone by morning. They were not gone by morning. The child's fever climbed. The second day I broke, not in front of them. I went out past the chicken run where the cottonwood is, where I'd carried the news of every grief in my life to be alone with it, and I put my fist against the bark and I wept like something dying. Because by the second day the child had said her one and only word to me, and the word was an accident, fever talk, half a dream. She'd reached up from the mattress with her hot little hand and caught my sleeve and said, "Grandma." Just that, not to me, to a dream or a memory or somebody she'd lost, but she said it looking at my face and I knew. I went back inside and I cooked. That's what I do. I made broth, the good kind, marrow and onion and the last of the dried sage, and I carried it to the barn, and I climbed that ladder with my old knees screaming, and I fed that child a spoonful at a time, holding her up against my chest, and Eli Hart sat in the corner of the loft watching me with his flat, hunted eyes, and at some point I said, without planning to, without deciding to, in a voice I didn't recognize, "Her mother, Iris, where is she?" The man went so still, I thought he'd stopped breathing. "You know," he said, not a question. "I know my own girl's eyes," I said. And Eli Hart, mountain man, 6 feet of patched coat and hard living, put his face in his 2 big hands and his shoulders started to shake. And that was how I learned my daughter was dead. She died 2 winters back. Not of cold, not of sickness, in childbirth, with a second baby that didn't live either, in a cabin 3 days' ride into the high country with only Eli and a midwife who came too late. Iris. My Iris. Gone 2 years and I never knew, never felt it, went on selling eggs and writing the weather in my ledger and accepting the town's pity, while my daughter bled out alone in the snow. I don't remember climbing down the ladder. I remember being at the cottonwood again with my whole body folded over the grief like it was a stone in my gut. I remember the cold ground. I remember Ruth the dog coming and pressing her old body against my side and just staying there, and that small animal kindness undoing me worse than anything. Here is what I understood, kneeling in the mud under that tree. Eli Hart was not a stranger who'd come to my door by chance. He had come to me. He had carried his dying daughter, my granddaughter, across the worst country in the territory in the worst season, half-starved, hunted, to bring her to the one place he thought might take her in. He had brought her home, to the woman who had thrown his wife out into the dark 30 years before. He had bet his own freedom and his own life on the gamble that the cruel old woman might be kinder to the child than she'd been to the mother. And I understood the other thing too, the thing that would matter most before the week was out. I asked him when I could speak again why he was running, why the soft knock, the flat eyes, the before someone sees. He told me, and I want you to hold on to it, because it's the hinge the whole rest of this turns on. There'd been trouble at a trading post on the Musselshell. A man dead. The man who died was a brute named Prout who cheated trappers for years and finally cheated the wrong one, and there'd been a fight, and in the fight Prout had gone for a knife and Eli had gotten there first. Self-defense, plain as daylight to anyone who'd seen it, but Prout had a brother. And the brother was a man with money and a bad-shaped friend, and he'd put it about that the wild man Hart had murdered an honest trader in cold blood. And there was paper out on Eli now with a number on it, and the number was big enough to make every hungry man in the territory a hunter. He'd been running for 4 months, with a sick child, in the spring mud. "I'll be gone in the morning," he said again, the same words as the first night, except this time his voice broke on them. "I never meant to bring it down on you. He looked over at Wren, asleep at last, her breath catching wet in her little chest. "I didn't have anywhere else. I'm sorry. God, I'm sorry, I'll go." I sat there in the hay with my dead daughter's child between us and my dead daughter's husband across from me, and 30 years of cowardice was sitting on my chest. And for the first and last time in my life, I felt the size of what I'd thrown away and exactly how much it would cost to begin to pay it back. "You'll go nowhere," I said. And then the dog started barking, and I heard the horses on the wagon track, and I had 90 seconds. I want you to picture it the way it was. A barn loft, a sick child who cannot be moved and must not make a sound, a wanted man worth more dead than alive to half the men in the territory, and 3 riders coming up my road, Sheriff Coyle and 2 I didn't yet recognize, at an easy, certain walk, the walk of men who have gotten a tip. Somebody had talked. I found out later who, and it broke my heart in a small, separate way, but that comes later. 90 seconds. I climbed that ladder faster than my knees should have allowed. I told Eli, fast, low, no time for argument, to take the child down into the cellar, the old root cellar under the barn floor that Tom had dug 40 years before, that nobody alive but me even remembered was there, behind the false back of the feed bins. I told him to take her down and to hold his hand over her mouth, gentle, gentle, only if she coughs, and to not come up no matter what he heard, no matter what, until I came for him myself. He looked at me, this man who had run 4 months and trusted nobody. He looked at me with my daughter's whole life in his eyes, the wife I'd cast out and he'd loved, and I watched him decide, in about 2 seconds, to put his child and his own neck entirely into the hands of the woman who'd done him the deepest wrong of his life. "Why," he said, "just that, why would you?" And I didn't have time to tell him the truth, which is the truth this whole story is trying to say, which took me the rest of my life to fully understand. So I told him the short version, the version that was also true. "Because I already lost her once," I said. "I won't lose what's left of her." Then I went down the ladder, and I picked up my fistful of dropped green onions from the garden dirt where I'd never finished, and I brushed off my apron, slow, and I walked out to my gate to meet the law with the easiest, emptiest, most lying smile I have ever put on my face. Sheriff Coyle touched his hat. "Morning, Della." "Morning, Lyle." I held up the onions like they were the only thing on my mind in all the world. "You'll have to forgive me, I'm half in the dirt. What brings the law up my road on a workday?" He looked at me a long moment. I have known Lyle Coyle since he was a boy stealing apples off the tree that's now a stump. He is not a stupid man. That was the trouble. "We're looking for somebody," he said. "Hard man, travels with a little girl. Word is he came through this way." Behind him, the 2 strangers were already looking past me, at the barn. "A man and a little girl," I said. "Out here. Lyle, the only thing that's come up my road in a month is you." And I laughed light, and it was the worst sound I ever made, and somewhere under our feet, under the barn floor, in the cold dark of a cellar nobody knew existed, a feverish child was fighting with everything in her small body not to cough. One of the strangers swung down off his horse. "Mind if we look in the barn?" he said. I have thought about that moment more than any other in my life. Not the big moments, not the funerals, not the wedding, not the night Iris walked out. This one, the small one in the spring mud, with a fistful of onions going limp in my hand and a man's boot already on my ground. Because everything turned on what I did with my face in the next 2 seconds. I have a theory about lying which I came to late and paid for dearly. People think a good lie is a clever one. It isn't. A clever lie has edges, and a man like Lyle Coyle has spent 30 years feeling for edges. A good lie is a boring one. It is so flat and so ordinary that the listener's mind slides right off it looking for something more interesting. So I didn't argue. Arguing is an edge, I shrugged. "Look all you want," I said. "Mind the cow, she kicks. And if you find a hired man in there, send him out. Lord knows I could use one." I turned my back on them, turned my whole back, which is the hardest thing in the world to do when your grandchild is hidden 40 feet away, and went back to my garden row and got down on my knees in the dirt and started pulling onions like the 3 of them weren't there at all. That's the trick. You have to be willing to be boring while your heart is coming apart. The stranger went into the barn. The second one followed. Lyle stayed by the gate, and I felt him watching the back of my neck, and I kept my hands moving in the dirt, and I prayed to a God I'd half quit believing in, that the child's fever had her too deep under to surface, that the man had his hand over her mouth gentle as a feather, that the false back on the feed bin still held after 40 years. I heard them in there, boots on the boards, the cow shifting and complaining, a bin lid banging, the scrape of a pitchfork through hay. They were stabbing the loose piles, the way you do when you think a man might be buried in them. Each stab went through me like it was meant for me. Then a long quiet, and in the quiet, very far down and very faint, so faint maybe only I could hear it because I'd been listening for it my whole life. A cough. One small, swallowed almost before it was out. I dropped an onion, on purpose. I made a little fuss of it. Oh, butterfingers, scrabbling in the dirt, talking to myself the way old women are allowed to, filling the air with a harmless noise right at the moment the dangerous one wanted to be heard. And maybe it worked, and maybe the cellar walls were just that thick, but the boots came back out of the barn, and the stranger said, sour, nothing. Old woman, hey, a half-dead cow. Told you, I said to my onions. But Lyle Coyle didn't move from the gate. Let me tell you about Lyle. He was the closest thing I had to a friend in Bitter Creek, which tells you something about my life. We were not close the way women are close. We were close the way two people are who have known each other so long that all the lying down of it has worn smooth, and there's just the bones of it left, the knowing. He'd carried my husband's coffin. He'd sat at this table the night we got word my son Tom the Younger died of the fever down in the Territory militia, and he'd not said one useless word, just sat, which is the only kind of comfort worth a damn. He knew me. That was the danger, but it was also, in the end, the door. He came through the gate, waved the strangers off, go water your horses at the trough, I'll be along. And they went, with that particular ill grace of men who think a job's being done sloppy. And then it was just Lyle and me and the onions, and he hunkered down on his heels beside me in the dirt, an old man's careful crouch, and he looked at the row of green I'd pulled, and he said, quiet. Della, how long we known each other? Long enough you should know better than to track mud in my garden, I said. 40 years. He picked up one of my fallen onions, turned it in his fingers. 40 years, and in all that time I never once knew you to drop a thing. Steadiest hands in the county. Used to say so. Della Mercer could thread a needle in an earthquake. He set the onion down, very gentle. You dropped that one just now, right when my man was coming out of the barn. I didn't say anything. There was no boring lie left big enough for this. There's paper out on him, Lyle said. Big paper, Hart. Killed a man on the mussel shell, they say, and there's a child with him. He was looking at the dirt, not at me, which was a kindness, the way not looking can be. And here's what I keep turning over, Della. 3 weeks ago a fella named Prout, brother of the dead man, comes through Bitter Creek flashing money, asking after a mountain man and a little girl, putting it about that there's reward for anyone points the way. And the very next Sunday, somebody in this town points the way, points it right up your road. My stomach went to ice. Who? That's the thing. Now he did look at me, and his old eyes were sad. You're not gonna want to hear it. I have to step out of the story here for a moment, because the next thing I learned is the thing that, of all the things, I have never made my peace with. It was the Reverend's wife, Edith Vance. Edith and I had sat in the same pew for 25 years. She'd brought me a pie when Tom died. She was a small, soft, pious woman who quilted and prayed and meant, I am quite sure, every good thing she said. And 3 weeks before she had seen something. A light in my barn loft late where there's no cause for a light, maybe a shape at the window. She'd put it together with the talk of a hunted man and a child, and she had done what she believed was her plain Christian duty. She had told the Reverend, who had told it as a matter of concern for poor Della living alone with who knows what about. And it had traveled the way such concern travels, pew to the ear of a man named Prout with money in his fist. She did not do it to hurt me. That is the part I can't get past. There was no malice in it. She'd have been horrified to know what her concern set rolling, a child nearly dragged out of a cellar, a man nearly hanged. She thought she was helping. She thought I was the one needing rescue. That is how the worst things happen up here. Not from wickedness. From good people, certain they're being good, who never once stopped to ask the question that would have stopped them cold. What if Della has a reason I can't see? The town never asked. They'd never had to. They'd known me 30 years as the steady widow, the grieving mother, the woman who'd lost her wild daughter to the world and accepted God's will about it. There was no room in the Della they knew for a barn light and a hunted man. So when the facts didn't fit the woman, they didn't change their picture of the woman. They changed the facts into a danger I needed saving from. I think about Edith Vance and her good intentions more than I think about Prout and his bad ones. The bad men in this life you can see coming. It's the good ones, sure of their goodness, that you never do. So, Lyle said, still crouched there in my garden, I'll ask you plain and you can lie to me if you want to, and I'll likely have to act on the lie, but I'd rather you didn't. He took a long breath. Is he in there, Della? Is Hart in your barn? And here is where I made the second great decision of my life. The first had been 30 years before, at my kitchen door, when I chose the town over my daughter and told her to walk out into the dark. I would not make it twice. No, I said, he's not in my barn. Which was true, he was under it. Lyle looked at me a long, long moment, and I watched something move behind his old eyes. I watched a man who'd known me 40 years weigh everything he knew of me against the law he'd sworn to. I watched him want to believe me, and I understood in that moment that he already half knew, that the dropped onion had told him, that he was not asking me a question so much as offering me a door, and the door said, "Give me a true thing I can stand on, Della, and I'll find a reason to ride away." So I gave him one, not the lie, the truth, the one piece of it I'd never said out loud to a living soul in 30 years. "Lyle," I said, "that little girl Prout's hunting, the one worth all that money." My voice did something I couldn't control. "She's mine. She's Iris's. My Iris didn't die back east, Lyle. I lied. I threw her out 30 years ago to keep my place in this town's good books, and she died 2 winters back in the high country and I never even knew, and that man you're hunting carried her baby 300 miles in the snow to bring her home to the only blood she's got left." I was crying now and I didn't care, didn't wipe it, let him see all of it. "So you go on and look. You look as hard as you want, but you'll be dragging a 6-year-old out of the cold to send her papa to a rope for a killing every man on that river knows was Prout's own brother going for a knife. And you'll do it on the word of Edith Vance's concern. You decide if that's the law you want to be." The garden was very quiet. A meadowlark went off somewhere down the fence line, that long liquid call, the most ordinary sound in the world, while 2 old people knelt in the dirt with the whole weight of a child's life between them. Lyle Coyle stood up. His knees cracked, same as mine do. He looked at the barn for a long while. Then he looked down at me, and he said the thing I will hear in my head until I die. "Iris had your stubborn," he said. "I always thought so. Used to watch her in church, jaw set just like yours." He put his hat back on. "I'm sorry, Della, about all of it. The town, me too. We were all so busy being decent we never once thought to be kind." And he walked to the gate, and he called to his men that the trail was cold, that Hart had clearly pushed on north, that they'd wasted a morning on a fool's tip, and they'd best ride for the Sweetgrass crossing if they meant to catch him. I knelt there in the onions and watched the 3 of them ride back down my road, easy, the way they'd come, and I did not move until the dust had settled and the meadowlark had quit, and the only sound left was old Ruth's tail thumping the porch boards. I had won. I want you to feel how completely I believed, in that moment, that I had won. I went and got them out of the cellar at dusk, when I was sure no one had doubled back to watch the place. I'd waited near 6 hours. 6 hours those 2 spent in the cold dark under the floor, the man with his arms around the child, keeping her warm with his own failing body, his hand near her mouth the whole time and never once needing to use it hard, because, he told me after she'd understood. 6 years old and burning with fever, and she'd understood that quiet meant living, and she'd lain there against her father's chest in the black and not made a sound. When I lifted the false back and the lamplight fell down into that hole, Eli Hart looked up at me, and the child looked up at me, and neither of them said anything, and I climbed down into the cellar with my bad knees, and I gathered the both of them up in my arms at once, the man and the child, my dead daughter's whole remaining world, and the three of us sat down there in the dirt and held on. That was the night Wren spoke to me, her second word in the world, after the fevered grandma that wasn't really meant for me. She put her hot little hand against my wet cheek, and she said, in a voice like a rusty hinge, a voice that hadn't been used in months, "Don't cry. I have been told many things in my life. I have been told I do, and I have been told he's gone, and I have been told the price of eggs every market day for 40 years. I have never been told anything that went into me as deep as those 2 words from that child, who had every reason in the world to cry herself, and was instead worried about an old woman who'd done nothing in 30 years to earn 1 ounce of her tenderness. 'Don't cry,' she said. 'I'm crying now writing it, so much for that. We had 10 days. I'm telling you the number now so it doesn't sneak up on you the way it snuck up on me. 10 days, between the morning Lyle rode away and the thing that came after. 10 days that were, I think, the happiest of my whole long life, which is its own kind of terrible, that the happiest stretch of 61 years should be 10 stolen days hiding fugitives in my barn. The fever broke on the 3rd day. I'd sat up with her 2 nights running, sponging her down, dripping willow bark tea between her cracked lips a drop at a time, and on the 3rd dawn she opened her eyes clear, clear. I knew that clear. I'd seen it once before in my own son and prayed 30 years to see it again. And she looked at me and she said, "I'm hungry." And I laughed so hard and cried so hard at once that Eli came scrambling up the ladder thinking something was wrong. After that she came back to herself by inches, the way a creek comes back after a hard freeze. She started following me about the place. She named the chickens, every one, foolish names, Mr. Buttons and the General, and one black hen she called Iris without knowing, just because she liked the sound, and I had to walk to the cottonwood over that one. She combed old Ruth till the dog looked moth-eaten and was beside herself with joy about it. She'd been a child raised half-wild in the high country, could skin a rabbit and read weather off a sky better than most grown men, and she'd never in her life had a grandmother's kitchen to be small and safe inside of, and she took to it like she'd been starving for it, which I suppose she had. And Eli I came to love in a different way, slower, the way you come to respect a thing that's been through fire and held its shape. He fixed everything on the place that I'd let go in my widowhood, mended the corral, the harness, the bad hinge on the smokehouse door that had hung crooked for 3 years. He didn't talk much, but in the evenings after Wren was down, he'd sit at my table and we'd put the lamp low and he'd tell me about Iris, bit by bit, how she'd laughed, how she'd been the one who wasn't afraid of the high country, who'd loved it, how at the end, the very end, she'd asked him to do one thing. "She made me promise," he said one night, turning his cup in those big scarred hands, not looking at me. "Said if it ever got bad, if I was ever down to nothing, said to bring Wren to you, said you'd come around, said her mama was hard but her mama wasn't cruel down underneath." He finally looked up. "I didn't believe her, pardon me, but I didn't. I figured you'd slam the door. I came because I was out of every other thing to try, but she believed it. To the last she believed her mama would do right by the girl. She forgave me. That's what he was telling me. My daughter, lying down to die 300 miles away from the mother who'd cast her out, with her last breath had told her husband to trust me, had believed in a goodness in me I had given her no reason on this earth to believe in. I had spent 30 years thinking the wrong I'd done was a closed account, a debt past paying, a dead thing. And here was my dead girl reaching out of the snow to tell me it was never closed at all, that she'd left it open, that she died still holding the door for me. I did not deserve that. I want to be very clear. There is nothing I did before or after that earned a forgiveness like that. It was just given. Free. The way the only forgiveness worth anything ever is. So that was the 10 days. The corral mended and the chickens named and my daughter's husband at my table and my daughter's daughter asleep in the loft, and an old woman lying awake every night listening to the wind, half in joy and half in a dread I couldn't name, because some part of me knew. You don't get 10 days like that, not at the end of a life like mine, without something coming to collect. I had thought the danger rode away with Lyle Coyle. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about it in the worst possible way, and I found out on the 10th night, when the dog started barking. Old Ruth again, the way she had 10 days before, except this time it was full dark, and there were no horses on the wagon road, because the men who'd come for us this time were too smart to use the road. Have told you that already, but I didn't understand the whole of it until that 10th night, lying in the dark with the dog's bark gone suddenly silent. And it was the silence that put my heart in my throat, because a dog doesn't quit barking at strangers. A dog quits barking when a stranger gets close enough to do something about it. I got out of bed. I did not light the lamp. 40 years in this house and I can cross any room of it blind, and I crossed the kitchen to the window by feel and put one eye to the gap in the shutter, and I looked out at my own yard in the thin light of a quarter moon. There were men at my barn. 3 of them that I could count, low and quiet, no horses I could see. They'd left the horses back in the cottonwoods and come the rest on foot, across the open ground, which is the work of men who have done this before and mean it. One was crouched by the barn door, working at it. The other 2 stood spread out in the yard, and the moonlight caught something in the hands of one of them, a long thing, a rifle held the way you hold a tool you're about to use. And Ruth, my old dog, half blind, all ribs, who'd barked at every shadow for 14 years, Ruth was lying still in the middle of the yard, and she was not getting up, and I understood what the silence had meant. They'd killed my dog to get to my barn quiet. I want to tell you that in that moment I felt fear, and I did, but underneath the fear something else came up in me, something I hadn't felt in 30 years, something hot and old and clean. They had killed a 14-year-old dog, in my yard, to come for a 6-year-old child sleeping in my loft. I have spent my life being a steady woman, a boring, careful, dishonest, frightened, steady woman. I felt all of that drop off me at the window like a coat I'd been wearing too long, and what was left underneath was something my daughter Iris would have recognized. I went and got the rifle. Here is the arithmetic, because I am a woman who thinks in arithmetic, and it is how I kept from coming apart. 1 old single-shot Springfield, last fired the year Tom died. 1 shell, I had a box of them gone green with age in the trunk, and my hands were shaking too bad to be sure of more than the one I could load. 3 men, at least, maybe more in the trees. A wanted man and a child in a loft with a single ladder up and no way down but past those men in the yard. And the only law that might help us a half-day's hard ride away in Bitter Creek, asleep. You cannot win that arithmetic. I knew it standing there in my nightdress with the cold rifle in my hands. There is no version of those numbers where an old woman and a hunted man and a little girl all walk out alive. So I stopped trying to win it. I want you to understand the thing that happened in me, because it is the heart of this whole story, and it is the thing the town never could have guessed. I stopped doing the arithmetic of winning, and I started doing the arithmetic of what is the most I can buy, and what will I spend to buy it. And the answer came to me as plain and cold as a column of figures. I could not save all 3 of us, but I might be able to buy enough noise, enough confusion, enough time, for 1 man to get 1 child out the back of the barn, and into the dark of the high country he knew better than any man alive, while the men in my yard were busy with the screaming old woman at the front. That was the figure I could afford, me for them. 30 years before, at my kitchen door, I had spent my daughter to keep my place in the town. Now I would spend my place in the world, my safety, my name, my life if it came to it, to keep my daughter's child. It was not a hard sum. After 30 years of carrying the first one, the second one was the easiest decision I ever made. It was almost a relief. Do you understand that? After 30 years, to finally be able to pay. I did not go out the front like a fool. I went out the side door, into the kitchen garden, into the dark, in my bare feet. And I'll tell you, the cold mud between my toes was the realest thing I'd felt in years. Every nerve in me lit up and screaming alive. I kept low along the fence line, the way I'd watched the men move, and I got around to the side of the barn where the old knothole is, the one I've meant to patch for a decade, and I put my mouth to it and I said, low and fast, into the dark of the barn, "Eli, Eli, out the back now, take her and run for the ridge. Don't stop, don't come back." A pause, then his voice a breath, "Della, no, come with." "There's no time to be a good man," I hissed. "Run for Iris, run." And then I walked out into the middle of my own yard, into the open moonlight with the rifle, and I started screaming. I screamed like the place was on fire. I screamed like a madwoman, which I suppose I was, an old woman in a white nightdress with wild gray hair come loose, waving a rifle and shrieking fit to wake the whole county. And it worked. It worked exactly the way I'd gambled, because 3 armed men who have crept up quiet to do a quiet murder are not ready for noise. Noise is the one thing they can't have. Noise carries. Noise means witnesses, means neighbors waking, means the careful private killing turning into a public reckoning. They came at me to shut me up, all 3, just as I'd hoped, away from the barn. The one with the rifle, a big man, and I knew without being told this was Prout. You could see the brother's brutishness in him even by moonlight. He came at me with his gun up and his voice low and vicious. "Quiet, you old." I did not quiet. I want to be honest about what happened next, because the town later made it into a story bigger than it was, and a true story is better than a brave one. I raised the old Springfield and I fired it, and I did not aim it at a man. I have never in my life pointed a gun at a person, and I did not start that night. I fired it straight up into the air, because the one thing worth more than a bullet in that moment was the sound of a gunshot rolling out across the valley at midnight, a sound that carries 5 miles on a still night, a sound that means something is wrong at the Mercer place, a sound that a half-dozen neighbors would sit up in their beds and hear and remember. The rifle was old and the shell was green, and it nearly took my shoulder off. I felt something tear. But it went off, God. It went off like a cannon, and in the half-second of every man in that yard flinching at the blast, I heard, behind me, far off at the back of the barn, the small distinct sound of a board being kicked loose and 2 bodies dropping down into the dark. They got out. In the noise I bought, they got out. Then Prout hit me, and the world went sideways, and I was down in the mud of my own yard with the taste of blood in my mouth and a man's boot on my chest, and he was saying things I won't write down, and the muzzle of his rifle was a cold circle against my forehead, and I thought, with a calm that surprised me, all right, this is the bill. I can pay this. I thought of Iris. I thought of Wren's hot little hand on my cheek. Don't cry. I closed my eyes. The shot that came was not the one meant for me. I have gone over it 100 times and I still don't have all the pieces, because I had my eyes shut and the world was roaring. But here is what I have put together, from what I heard and what I learned after. Eli Hart did not run. He got Wren clear, got her down out of the barn and over the back fence, and told her, I learned later, to run for the big rock on the ridge and to hide in the cleft of it, and not to come out for anybody but her grandmother. And she did. That brave child. She ran into the black alone. And then Eli Hart, wanted man, who had every reason in the world to keep running and never look back, turned around and came back for the old woman who told him not to. There's no time to be a good man, I told him. He was a good man anyway. It's the most expensive thing a person can be. He came out of the dark with no gun. He'd had no gun. He'd given his last shells away for food months back. He came out of the dark with nothing but his two big scarred hands and the whole size of him. And he took Prude off of me the way a flood takes a fence. And there was a terrible scramble in the mud, two big men and a gun between them, and the gun went off. When I could see again, one of them was getting up and one of them was not. It was Prude who was not. I will not dress it up. Eli Hart killed a second man that spring in my yard with that man's own rifle in the dark, while the other two scattered like crows at the sound of more guns coming because the neighbors had heard. The first shot, my shot into the sky, had done its work. Lights were coming on across the valley. A horse was already pounding up the wagon road, and it was young Sutter from the next place over, who'd heard the shots and grabbed his rifle and come, and behind him others, and the two hired men who'd run. They ran clean out of the county and were never seen again. And there in the bloody mud of my yard, in the lamplight that was starting to bloom from every window in the valley, stood Eli Hart over the body of the man who'd hunted him 300 miles, and the whole arithmetic had changed again, because now there were witnesses. A yard full of them, gathering, white-faced, holding lamps. The town had come. And here is the thing the town never expected. Here is the thing this whole story has been walking toward. They had come, every one of them, certain of what they'd find. They'd find what Edith Vance's concern had promised. Poor Della, victim at last of the dangerous wild man she'd foolishly let onto her place. They came ready to rescue me from him. Instead they found me on my feet. I'd gotten up, I don't know how, with my shoulder torn and my mouth bleeding, standing between Eli Hart and a dozen leveled rifles, my arms spread wide, putting my own body between the guns and my daughter's husband, screaming at them, the steady boring widow Mercer, screaming at the whole town at once. He saved my life. That man came to kill me, pointing at Prude in the mud. And this man saved my life, and if any one of you raises a hand to him, you'll answer to me, you'll answer to me. And I was weeping and bleeding and out of my mind. Where were you, where were any of you, you good people, you decent people, when my girl needed you 30 years ago? I don't remember all of what I said. They told me after. They said I told the whole town the truth of it, right there in the bloody yard at midnight. That the child on the ridge was Iris's, that Iris was dead, that I'd thrown her out to keep their good opinion and she died for it 300 miles away, and that I would die myself before I'd let this town's decency cost me one more thing it had no right to. And the town stood there in the lamplight and listened. Lyle Coyle came at dawn. Somebody had ridden for him. I had ridden back by then. I'd gone up the ridge myself, torn shoulder and all, before I'd let anyone tend me, and found her in the cleft of the rock exactly where her father had sent her, curled up small, and she'd come out for me, only for me, and clung to my neck so hard it hurt the bad shoulder, and I didn't care. I'd have let her hang on it forever. Lyle looked at the body. He looked at the dozen witnesses, every one of whom had heard me scream the truth and seen the dead man's rifle and the way the thing had gone. He took statements. He was thorough. He was a good lawman, Lyle, to the last. And then he did the thing that cost him, because there was still paper out on Eli Hart for the killing on the Musselshell. And a lawman who lets a wanted man walk is a lawman who can lose his star and worse. He wrote it up that Eli Hart had died. He wrote that the wanted man Hart had been killed in the gunfight at the Mercer place, along with the man Prude, the two of them having quarreled and shot each other, and that the bodies of both were buried on the property. There was a grave. Lyle saw to it there was a grave with a marker, and it has a name on it that is not the right name, and I tend it to this day with flowers in the summer because the town expects it, and because there's a kind of truth to it anyway. The wanted man Eli Hart did die that spring. A free man named something else rode out of the valley a week later, healed up, with the law's own paper saying he was dead. It's the only way the girl keeps her father, Lyle told me the morning he signed it. Reward paper doesn't chase a dead man. He looked old doing it. He looked like a man spending something he couldn't get back. I spent 40 years being decent, Della. Reckon it's time I tried being kind. You taught me the difference. Took you near killing yourself, but you taught me. So, that's the story the town never expected. They came up my road that spring expecting to rescue a foolish old woman from a dangerous man, and what they found was that the dangerous man had taken a bullet meant for me, and the foolish old woman had been hiding her own grandchild, and the only danger in the whole valley had been their own decency, sure of itself, polished smooth, that 30 years before had cost a girl her mother, and very nearly that spring had cost a child her father. Eli stayed in the county 3 more years under his new name, a hand at the Sutter place, close enough to see Wren most weeks. He never could settle, though. The high country was in him too deep, and the grief of Iris, and one autumn he rode up into it and didn't come down, and I had a letter the next spring from a settlement up north, in a hand not his, saying he'd gone in his sleep through a hard winter, and asked at the end that I be told and that I keep the girl. So I have 2 graves now I tend that hold the wrong men or no men at all, and one of them I put real flowers on, because whatever the marker says, he was the best man I ever knew, and the only one who ever came back for me. Wren grew up in this house. She's a woman now, grown and gone to her own place over the mountain, and she has a daughter, and the daughter has black hair and a will like a spring flood, and a way of setting her jaw that stops my heart every time. Because it's Iris's jaw, it's my jaw, it's the stubborn that runs down the women of this line like water down a hill. The child calls me Gran. The first one to ever call me that and mean it, after the one who said it in a fever and didn't. I am very old now, I keep the ledger still. The hand is shakier. The weather still goes in it, and the price of eggs, and now and then a thing that has no number to it at all. I have thought all these years about why I did it. The town still asks, the ones old enough to remember, why Della? Why hide them? Why nearly die for a man you'd known 3 days and a child you'd never met? And I've given them all sorts of answers over the years, true ones about blood and grief and the debt I owed my girl. But here is the realest one, the one I've only ever written down, never said. I did not save them to make up for Iris. You can't make up for a thing like that. There's no arithmetic that balances it. I've tried, and the column never comes out even. I saved them because my daughter, dying, 300 miles away, with every reason to curse my name, told her husband her mama wasn't cruel down underneath. She left the door open for me. And the only thing I had left in this world worth doing was to be, just once before the end, the woman my daughter died believing I already was. I don't know if I managed it, that's the truth. I don't know if any of it came out even. But the child came out for me, on the ridge in the dark. She came out only for me.